The second part of these instructional videos will review a brief introduction to modules 10 and 11, and I will go over the activities for this week, week 5. So, talking about clinical intuition, if we are wanting to determine what constitutes a mental disorder, what would actually be diagnosed by a clinician, that's somewhat subjective, and it's actually determined by cultural norms. So first we'd want to ask ourselves, what is normal and what is abnormal? And three things tend to be the most common definitions of what is abnormality. So on the right side there, you can see the normal curve, which some of you may have seen before in some of your statistics classes or research methods classes. If we're talking about something that's statistically infrequent, that would be something that is near the outside of that normal curve. So you can see 68% of observations in that blue spot are the majority of observations. If you go out one more standard deviation on each side to 2 standard deviations, then you have 95%, which is basically almost all. So if we're talking about statistically infrequent, we're probably talking about the things that are either greater than plus 2 standard deviations from the mean or minus 2 standard deviations from the mean, or even bigger than that. So if we're talking about height, let's say for example, we're talking about women's height. Average women's height is 5'5", and let's assume for the moment that the standard deviation for height is 6 inches. So that means that the mean plus 1 standard deviation would be 5'11". So let's say any woman who is taller than 5'11", that would be fairly statistically infrequent. It may have to be 2 standard deviations higher, so 6'5", taller than 6'5", to call it abnormally tall, if that makes sense. Another thing could be strange or undesirable. This is definitely subjective, definitely determined by cultural norms. We already talked about social desirability, so anything that's undesirable would be something that's considered abnormal. And as far as the actual person's experience, if it's a source of unhappiness, if something is a source of unhappiness for them, if it makes them sad or if it makes them uncomfortable, or if they aren't able to accurately interact with reality, that could be another sign of abnormality. So you might have heard of the DSM, abbreviated DSM. It's gone through several iterations. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it was created by a group of medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, who all collaborated in order to create a standard for diagnosing mental disorders. Each version represents cultural and social progress. We're currently at number 5. The current version incorporates a more dimensional approach to diagnoses, so rather than having a discrete kind of all or none diagnosis, you can be diagnosed as being relatively high or low, which is helpful for knowing how severe something could be and how you should approach that. The module also talks about different ways of measuring mental illness or different mental conditions. Implicit personality tests, like the Rorschach inkblot test that you may have heard of, and the Draw a Person test, are assessed subjectively, which can lead to the potential for bias in evaluation. Practitioners could fall prey to the illusory correlation, which means they would look for certain responses that correspond with their hypothesized diagnosis, and they would ignore evidence that doesn't support their assumptions. Clinicians may also engage in the confirmation bias. So if they think that their client has a troubled past that's leading to current issues, they may ask questions that uncover difficult situations for that client, even if there weren't that many of the difficult situations, and it really isn't an overwhelming reason for them feeling the way they do. And neither statistical nor intuitive predictions can perfectly predict an outcome, but as the book mentions, statistical predictions are, in general, much more accurate than intuitive predictions. And you'll definitely want to check out that section to find the fine points. And as you read through this module, also check out the 4 implications for better clinical practice. Module 11 applies social cognition to the therapy setting. Social cognition you can think of as the juncture between cognitive psychology, which studies how we think, and social psychology, which, as we've talked about, is the interaction between our minds and the social environment. Kind of the effects and the interactions of social situations and environments with individuals. Therapeutic appointments often focus on thought processes, and they also sometimes consider the social environment, so how people in situations around you can influence your mental health, because none of us lives in a vacuum. We're all influenced by our situations around us. Social cognition has been applied to multiple cognitive issues such as depression, loneliness, and anxiety. And before I talk about how social cognition has been applied to each of these, I just want to briefly mention that at any point in time, roughly 20% of people are experiencing some kind of mental illness or some kind of symptom that is causing them some kind of emotional or cognitive distress. So, if any of you are experiencing any depressive symptoms, if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling anxious, I would strongly encourage you to reach out sooner than later to any kind of counselor on campus or any person that you feel could be a good resource. I realize that I am online, and so it's kind of difficult to have conversations about these kinds of things, but if you are experiencing any of these symptoms, I would strongly encourage you to tell somebody about it. And sooner rather than later, as I said. So, the way that social cognition has been applied to depression symptoms, the book mentions the construct of depressive realism, so also known as the sadder but wiser effect, where although you have more of a negative view of the world, you're actually better able to more accurately predict how people think about you. You're more accurately able to interpret the world around you. The book also talks about attributions of responsibility, having a negative explanatory style, and this builds on what we've talked about before with attributions. So if you have stable, global, and internal attributions for failure, that means that if something bad happens, you think, well, it's this stable reason, which means it's not going to change. It's a global reason, which means it's true of every aspect of my life. And it's internal, which means it's my fault. So, as you can imagine, having those different attributions for something bad happening to you are definitely going to contribute to those depressive symptoms. And the book mentions the circle of depression. So not only do moods modify memories, the way that we think about our past, but negative thinking causes depressed moods. So it's kind of this circular, cyclical pattern that you see. So it's not that one causes the other, it's that they both kind of cause each other in turn. And there are some cultural differences in depression too, so definitely check those out when you're reading through this module. Looking at how social cognition is applied to loneliness, the book differentiates between solitude or being alone and the feeling of loneliness. So it's a very important differentiation. You can be spending time by yourself and be completely happy, completely content, and you could also be surrounded by people and feel really lonely. So the loneliness sensation isn't dependent on how many people are around you. The section on loneliness also discusses the associations between loneliness, health, physical sensations, cognitions, and even some benefits to feeling lonely. So check that out. Looking at social cognition and anxiety, the book mentions that social anxiety is feeling worried about how others perceive us. We want them to like us, but we doubt ourselves. So it's that two-pronged issue of wanting to have that social connection, but not being confident in your own abilities to interact with other people. And you'll want to pay attention to the 5 situations in which we are most likely to experience social anxiety. The book also discusses some ways that these unpleasant feelings can be treated by social psychological approaches. In the section titled Inducing Internal Change Through External Behavior, pay attention to how the concepts in Module 9 are applied to the therapy setting. And the book also discusses a few approaches that address the cyclical or circular pattern of depressed mood and negative cognitions, like social skills training and seeking out positive experiences to bolster self-perceptions. Moving on to the activities for this week. Again, I would suggest looking at your feedback from the week 4 activities. So I made some comments on some of the short answer questions in exam 1, and the comments from the online posts are in the first part of the instructional video. Read through modules 10 and 11. As I mentioned, I moved module 11 to this week to kind of even out the spread a little bit. And then the remaining things will be due Sunday at midnight. So online post 4 will be due Sunday at midnight. And in this online post, I would like you to describe an experience that you had at a job interview and explain how that experience, how your behavior in that situation was similar to and different from your behavior in what might be a more typical setting. So something that you would find yourself in on a day-to-day basis. So it could be being in the classroom or spending time with friends. And then compare those two behavioral assessments. So your behavior in the job interview and your behavior in a more typical setting. And be sure to explain what that typical setting is too. And then identify which of those two you feel is a more accurate representation of your behavior. And then go back to the text and talk about how that comparison is similar to or different from the comparison between performance at a graduate school interview and a composite of GRE scores, undergraduate GPA, and letters of recommendation. The next part is to complete quiz 4 by Sunday at midnight, and that will refer to, it'll focus mostly on modules 10 and 11, but it will also include some content from earlier readings. And then last, elect a group member to submit your reference list by Sunday at midnight. And there are some references that I've posted on Scholar that you can check out. I created a paper template that I think I mentioned last week. If you look at the last page of that, and I'll pull that up here. So this actually shows you what your references will look like. And as I mentioned, what I would encourage you to do is just download this template and then replace the content in those references with the content of your articles. And I have some notes throughout too, so you can see things that you should be looking at. And I would encourage you to include a header too. This doesn't have to be, of course, the official title of your paper, but just to kind of get used to doing the header and having the page number in there. So you can walk through, see, as I mentioned here, references is not bolded because it begins on a new page. So this is the last name, and then the last name of the second author, and these are the initials, first and middle initials, first, middle initials. You'll notice there's a comma here and an and sign, the year in parentheses with a period, and then the title of article is next. This is not italicized. The name of the journal goes after that, which is capitalized and italicized. Volume number is italicized. The issue number is not, and it is in parentheses. And then you have the page range after a comma. And then last, you have the DOI, which stands for the Digital Object Identifier. It's kind of like a unique identifier for each article that comes out. And they started doing this in the mid to late 90s. So if you have an older article, it may not have one. May have a permalink instead. If you have an article that is a little bit older and you're not able to find a DOI, just let me know. I'd be happy to help you find something that you could use in exchange for that. If it is a newer article, it should have the DOI on the very first page of the article, or if there's a reference sheet that comes before the first page, it should be on that. And of course, as with everything else, if you have any questions, just let me know. I'd be happy to help you figure stuff out. And you should have at least 5 references. If you have more than that, then you could be eligible for some additional points. I want to briefly show you the Purdue OWL too as another reference. If you just search Purdue OWL, you'll be able to find this. And one thing you may want to use is the Articles in Periodicals page. So this shows pretty similar to what I had in the template. So those are the activities for this week. If you have any questions, just let me know, and I look forward to reading your online posts. Have a great week.